One of the most important handreading influences upon me in the 1990s was a woman called Laura Thornton, who is probably the most important hand reader that you've never heard of. Laura was a member of the Chirological Society from about 1982, and she and I kind of both started learning hand reading about the same time. I started in 1983, but we didn't actually meet each other until 1989. And we kind of sort of went in parallel with each other. She lived in a part of the UK called Leeds, which was a very long way further north from where I was living at that time, which was Oxford. And so I never really went up that way. But I remember one time I think I was going to Edinburgh and I thought I'd go and see her. So I went to see her on the way to Edinburgh, and it was on the way to Scotland. So I went to sort of see her. And the very first time we met, we got on like an absolute house on fire. Here was somebody else who was completely dedicated to hand reading like I was. And what was remarkable about Laura was that she actually had her own business in the centre of Leeds. And she had an office and she actually employed a secretary. She was so busy hand reading. She did 8 hand readings a day, 5 days a week. What, 50 days, 50 weeks of the year? I don't know. She was an absolute professional hand reader. And because she did so many hand readings, she was able to understand the significance of hands and basically do all this research on hands and had this absolutely enormous wealth of information that she could provide for people. Her most important book was her starting point for studying handreading was the Dora Hutchinson book, Your Life in Your Hands. And she always used to say, about this book, she would basically say, if anybody ever finds it, please give it back to me. There's a £50 reward for that, which is a lot of money back in the 1980s. This copy that I have cost £3.50, so £50 is a lot of money. But she basically, I think, so her start point into handreading was that, and then she joined the Chirological Society. So by the time we met, we were both experienced hand readers, and so we just had so much to say to each other about hand reading, and we basically we spent as much time as we could together, and you can see from that photograph how kind of close we were. It was a wonderful relationship that we had, and a totally respectful relationship. We just had total respect for each other's intellectual integrity and our interest in chirology. And she was one of the people who wrote an awful lot of things as well. So I actually found this the other day. I actually have a folder, which I've got here, which is basically a kind of folder of her collected writings. She wrote about the brain hemispheres and hands. She wrote about the physiology of the hand, like the bones in the hand and how they affected the development of the hand, the thumb. But two of the most important research projects she did was the hand and height, and nails. And so this is what she used to do because she saw so many people in her clinic. She would do something like, okay, well, let's find out about the size of the hand. Does that matter? And so she would measure everybody's hands, and she would come up, after a year, she would do this project for years. So everyone who came in, she would just measure their hands, and then she would produce this tabulated chart of different people's hand lengths and what that basically showed about them, and basically could work out whether they had long hands or large hands or small hands, and what that significant was in relationship to their height. So she'd ask them their height, she'd measure their hands, she'd just do these tabulated graphs and work out whether they're more detail-orientated type of person or they were more generalist. And so she would do studies like that, and she would just undertake that and then produce the articles that she would then publish in the Chirological Society journals as well. So that was one big one, the size of the hand in relationship to height. That was a big one. But another really important one that she did was nail shape and health. So again, what she did was she would basically interview all her clients who came to her for hand reading and ask them about their medical histories and ask them what kind of disease they had, and make a note of the, and then make a note of the shape of their nails. And so one of the most important pieces of work that she did around that was working out which disease conditions associated and which health conditions associated with particular nail shapes, which is another groundbreaking piece of work that she did there. And again, like with Johnny, she was reading so many hands. So this was an incredibly practical, hands-on person who was able to verify lots of the ideas that she had read about, or things that I would talk about with her, that we would discuss in the Chirological Society and go back and validate them or invalidate them according to experience. And so this was the kind of the really the beauty of the Chirological Society Advanced Seminar Groups. So then you've got the kind of triumvirate of myself and Laura and Johnny. So Laura and Johnny are the really out and out, hard out, practical hand readers who are reading lots of hands on a daily basis and got a lot of the field experience. And then there's me as the kind of having the overview and the kind of framework for collating those ideas and creating some coherency around them. And so this was kind of like a really important work that we all did together, and to learn an awful lot about hands and what works and what didn't work. And we just kind of ruthlessly just went through everything. Does that work? No. What about in your experience? No, it doesn't work at all. Does that work? Well, there's something in that. And so, for example, like the affection lines, what they call the marriage lines in palmistry. So she did a big research project on that as well, and basically asking, do they show marriages? Do they show babies? And she completely showed that none of that stuff has anything to do with marriage and nothing to do with babies whatsoever. And she would write a report, that's from 1991, but she would write about that. And so it was a wonderful time to be around in the Chirological Society, because she would just producing all these different articles and different things that she would produce at the seminars. There's one here on the major earth line, another one on the Simian line. She was on originator of all sorts of interesting ideas about the minor airline. You know, this is someone who's actually thinking about hand reading and comparing her thought processes of that with the actual lived experience of looking at hands on a daily basis. And so when you've got that, you've got a very rich synthesis of those two strands and approaches to knowledge. And of course, that's very valuable if you're going to develop a hand reading system that actually works. So I want to really acknowledge both Laura Thornton and Johnny in developing the hand reading, which I'm teaching now, which Johnny's teaching now, which Felicity's teaching now, because it was out of this kind of cauldron of intense fervor for about 5 or 6 years between about 1992 and 1998 that we got together and did these research seminars and study groups and thrashed out all these ideas together. It was an incredibly fertile time for hand reading, and and so many people who studied with us at that time have gone on to be doing hand reading for 30 years, and there are still practicing hand readers out there now who studied within that particular study group at that time. And that's really quite a unique thing. I think most of the time when you talk to hand readers, they don't have a legacy like that. Most hand readers will write a book. There's actually very few people who actually develop a kind of school of hand reading and then have a tradition that comes out from that people are sort of following that way of doing things. I mean, Richard Unger's done it to some extent in America, Arnold Holtzman to some extent in Israel. But there's, in both of those cases, there's a sort of dogmatic quality about what they teach and certainly how their students present it, which I find disquieting. But what I was particularly fond of in terms of the study group was that we were basically all in this together. We were all learning together. We were all finding out from each other. And it created this kind of very fertile space to encourage people to learn and to encourage people to study and to encourage people to investigate the different meanings of the hand. And that's been the consequences. Those people have gone on to do all sorts of interesting research stuff and interesting projects that they've done themselves as a result of that time in that particular group. I mean, Lynn Steele is not somebody who's written any books, but Lynn has been involved with most of the online palmistry groups that have been around since the internet began. She's been a moderator or an admin or a very significant contributor to all sorts of online forums, including Martin van Manfort's one, the Hand Analysis Cafe that Hither Verlaat set up. I can't remember another. There's quite a few back in the day that have kind of come and gone now. But it was, that's another. Lynn was another woman who was involved in that seminar on mental health in the hand, along with Thelma Brill. And so these people, have continued doing hand reading on the basis of what we were doing at that time. But for me personally, Laura Thornton was a great inspiration. I felt like I'd met a kindred spirit, someone who had enough understanding and intelligence around hand reading that we could share ideas really productively together. And there was one little interesting thing that came in handy in 1999, which was she had been given Terry Jukes's handprints in, I don't know when she got given them, but probably in about 1984, 85, because he gave them to her for her foundation diploma chirology exam paper. And he gave his handprints for my intermediate chirology diploma paper. But the handprints he gave me were taken in 1985, and the handprints that he gave her were taken in 1972. So when we first met up in 1989, she said to me, she said, I think these handprints might be the handprints of Terry Jukes. I don't really like them. And I said, well, let's have a look. And I could see immediately they were, because I knew the handprints. So that's how we managed to get those handprints, the handprints of Terry Jukes from 1972 and 1985. Now, that's a whole other story, and I will do a different video to tell you the story about Terry Jukes. So that was a kind of fantastic thing that arose out of that meeting. And one more thing I think is worth relaying about Laura is that because she lived in Leeds, she was one of the first people who alerted me, anyway, and probably others, I suppose, to the nefarious deeds of Mr. Jimmy Savile. One of the consequences of being a hand reader is that people come and tell you all sorts of things that are going on in their lives. And she told me how many young women would come to her and say, oh, I've been in this situation with somebody and he's quite famous and it's all a bit terrible and I don't like it. And she knew it was Jimmy Savile, and she had dozens and dozens of women over the years coming to her that she heard. And so she heard all these stories about Jimmy Savile way before all the revelations about his sexual predation. And so we kind of knew about Jimmy Savile by the middle 1990s. Not that we were in any position to say anything about it at that time particularly, but yeah, one of the extreme advantages of being a hand reader is you do get this privileged information where people will tell you about what's going on about people in their lives. All right, so that's my second video on important influences on my chirological style. That's Laura Thornton, the most important hand reader you've never heard of. All right, like and subscribe. There'll be more stories coming soon.